Priya ma'am?
Yes, I'm
Hello.
here. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Yes. Devra sir. Yes.
Yes, shall we
Rathod
start?
sir, you can start the
Yes,
session.
yes, okay, sir. It's my great pleasure once again to be here as to introduce the speaker of the session, Dr. Priya Nair ma'am, in this faculty development program on literary theory and criticism under state component 1 research and capacity building organized by Department of English, KTHM College Nashik. We welcome you, ma'am, and appreciate your taking time off your schedule to join today. Dear participants, we also have with us Professor Dr. Binod sir, head of the department for this session. Uh, while glancing at the educational qualification of Priya ma'am, it can be, described in short. Ma'am has completed her postgraduate diploma in journalism from Symbiosis, Pune in 2007. Ma'am also completed her Doctor of Philosophy in English from University of Kannur, uh, titled Female Literary Identity and Dual Tradition, a reading of the novels of Margaret Atwood, Angela Carter, and Shashi Deshpande, and completed the research program with university scholarship. One most important thing is to be noted here, as well as I would like to quote here. In 2011, ma'am has qualified CELTA from UK. CELTA stands for Certificate in English Language Teaching to Adults. CELTA is an internationally recognized teacher training and certification program moderated and accredited by Cambridge Assessment English. While looking at the experience of the ma'am, ma'am also has a vast experience of teaching at various colleges from 2003 till July 2008. Ma'am also worked as a lecturer in St. Teresa's College, Ernakulam. From 2008 to 2009, ma'am also worked as an assistant professor in English department at RAK MHSU, Ras Al Khaimah, UAE. From 2010 to 2020, ma'am also worked as an assistant professor in English in St. Teresa's College, Cochin, India. And presently, from 2020 till date, ma'am is working as a research officer at Kerala State Higher Education Council, Trivandrum, in Kerala. Ma'am also has completed a UGC-sponsored minor project titled A Counter Narrative Azhar Nafisi, unveiled in 2016. Ma'am also has 22 research publications at her credit. Ma'am also delivered lectures at national and international seminars and at MHRD. So, such a great personality we have today to deliver the session on psychoanalysis. It means ma'am is going to deal with the psychological crisis which happens in our mind, and ma'am will try to unveil the crisis which we deal. Over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope my audio and video are clear. Could somebody please tell me? It's clear?
Okay, it's
Yes,
clear.
ma'am. You are clearly clear.
All right. So, good afternoon, everyone. Let me first thank Professor Gaikwad, the principal of the college, Dr. Sharad, who was in touch with me and head of the department. Thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to speak to you all in this FDP program on psychoanalysis. When there are certain areas, when teachers of English department, we just take over these areas and we sort of make it our own. But as with many other isms, and with psychoanalysis in particular, the beginning, the origin is the clinic. and the origin is in the field of medicine also. And I thought I would sort of divide my talk in such a way that I'll begin with the basics of psychoanalysis. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with these ideas, but I just want to use that as a starting point so that I can actually look at these ideas from a counter vision or a counter perspective, which is afforded by both post-colonialism and gendered identities. So this is the structure that I'm trying to follow. And yeah, the psychoanalysis, I think, actually develops with the idea that the mind can be read. Just like you read a text, just like you read a painting, the mind of a human being is also something which can be read. And not only can it be read, it can be decoded as well. And the understanding is that there are many layers to the human mind, and there is a constant struggle going on, whereby you have the basic outer the surface structure and also the deeper structure of the mind. And that's why we have this very, very well-known quotation from Lacan, who says that the unconscious is structured like a language. And the closely connected with psychiatry is psychoanalysis, though I think in the present day age and time, psychiatry, the department of psychiatry, as far as medicine is concerned, looks at psychoanalysis with a bit of skepticism. And in the field of English literature, we have sort of used the perspectives afforded by psychoanalysis to, to analyze characters from Hamlet onwards. We have Ernest Jones, who speaks about Hamlet as a real human being, and the psychiatric problems that Hamlet actually has. And closely connected with psychoanalysis is the concept or the idea of trauma. And the contemporary age has also been called the age of trauma, because, and I think that is very, relevant here, because we are passing through a unprecedented pandemic, and definitely different types of trauma is being experienced by people all over the world. Therefore, I think for more reasons than one, the contemporary age has been called the age of trauma. And when we think of psychiatry itself, we know that it begins from the act of confession. And by talking to the priest, actually, it began in the Catholic Church, where the faithful had to confess to the priest. I'm talking about the Western-centric or the Eurocentric aspect of psychoanalysis, because most of the theories that we deal with in the literature, English literature classrooms, have to deal with the Western-centric theories that we have been given. So, yeah, I'll just begin with my slides. And I begin with a quotation from German Greer, who said that psychoanalysis is confession without absolution. Let me see if I can share my screen quickly. Otherwise, it's all right. I can share it with you later. Yeah. I do not know if you can see my screen. All right. So we begin from, a quotation from German Greer, who said that psychoanalysis is the confession without absolution. And I understand that psychoanalysis is a type of therapy that aims to release repressed emotions and memories, or lead the client, the person who's undergoing this therapy, to healing. And the goal of psychoanalysis, it has been said, is to bring what exists at the unconscious or subconscious level right up to your conscious mind. And of course, without mentioning Sigmund Freud, one cannot go forward. And Sigmund Freud actually gives to us three models of the mind. They're the conscious, the pre-conscious, and the unconscious. The conscious mind is filled with the current thoughts and feelings.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah?
Ma'am, the slides are not visible, ma'am.
Now it is visible. Now it is visible.
Is it visible?
Okay, yes, yes. Okay.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Again it is gone. Again it is gone.
It's gone.
Yeah, ma'am. Yes. Okay, clear.
Is it fine?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay. Is it all right?
Yes, ma'am. It's all right.
Yes,
All
ma'am.
right.
Yes,
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so Freud actually gives you three models of the mind: the conscious, which is structured with your current thoughts and feelings; the pre-conscious, which is also been called the subconscious, and it is based on your memory, what your memory wants to recall; and finally, the unconscious, which we know is the repository of all our instinctual desires and something which hardly ever comes to the surface. So these are things I know I am repeating, but I'm repeating it just so that in order to frame a counter narrative, this will be of use for us. And this three sections of the mind can also be compared to three metaphorical parts. And you have the id and the ego and the superego. And the id operates at the unconscious level and again focuses on the instinctual drives and desires. And it is said that there are two instincts which are from the body, which make up the id of anybody. The eros is the instinct to survive, to engage in life, and to try to sustain life. And the thanatos is the death instinct that derives destructive and violent behavior. The ego acts as a check on the id. It is tied to reality. And the superego is the portion of the mind in which morality and principles reside and which encourages us or sort of uh, try to mold us into acting in a way in which the society wants us to behave. And Freud believed that these three parts are in constant conflict with each other. And therefore, any individual will try different sorts of methods to handle these three parts of your mind. And these are known as defense mechanisms, whereby your instinctive feelings are trying to be pushed out of your mind, and therefore you're trying to project it in a different way. And these are your defense mechanisms. It can either go into repression, where you completely deny these disturbing thoughts. You're pushing these disturbing thoughts out of your mind. Then there is denial. That is, your ego will block upsetting experiences and the individual will refuse to acknowledge. So either you push it down or you sort of pretend that it doesn't exist. Then is the projection, where you attempt to solve the discomfort by attributing the individual's unacceptable thoughts and feelings to another person. You project it in whatever you want to feel, but you're not allowed to because of social taboos. You're projecting onto somebody else. And of course, you have the interpretation of dreams written by Freud, which came out in 1900. And then you had Carl Jung as well, who actually agreed on certain things and agreed to disagree on many other things. So the three main differences between the Freudian psychology and the analytic psychology put forward by which is called the Jungian psychology. One is the nature and the purpose of the libido. If Jung saw the libido as a general source of psychic energy that motivated a wide range of human behaviors, Freud saw it as a psychic energy, and Freud actually connects it with sexual gratification. And if we go back to Freud, we realize that the basic impulse that Freud often deals with and most focuses on is the idea of sexual gratification, which begins from infancy onwards. And the next point where Jung and Freud differ is the nature of the unconscious. So Freud viewed the unconscious as a storehouse for the individual's socially unacceptable desire, that which has been considered as taboo by society. But Jung believed it was more of a storehouse for the individual's repressed memories of a society, and that is what is we understand as the collective unconscious. And Freud saw that behavior as being caused solely by past experiences, most notably from childhood, whereas Jung actually brings in the future aspects and the aspirations, your dreams about the future as well. So these are the three main areas where Jung and Freud differ. And then I know I'm skipping a couple of generations of psychoanalysts, but the next main person who is usually used in English literature classrooms is, of course, Jacques Lacan. And I'm sure that, again, this is just repetition. Lacan's psychoanalysis that is set apart from Freudian original talk therapy. So this hypnotism and the confession, all that was finally labeled as Freudian talk therapy. And again, even within the psychoanalytic discipline, Freud is sort of looked upon as somebody who initiated the process, but many of Freud's ideas, many of Freud's projects have been abandoned by contemporary psychoanalysts. So to come back to Lacan, Lacan actually talks about the real, the symbolic order, and the mirror stage. So when Freud saw the symbolic as being indicative as of a person's unconscious mind, which is revealed actually in dreams, Lacan's theorization of the real was actually quite different. He sort of looked at the real as the most foundational level of the human mind. According to Lacan, we exist in the real and experience anxiety because we realize that there are several factors that are beyond our control. So it is unpredictable, it is random. And unlike the symbolic, which Freud proposed could be accessed through psychoanalysis, the real, according to Lacan, cannot be accessed so easily. So once we understand, so once we enter the symbolic order, once we understand language, we are completely cut off from what Lacan has called the real. He describes the real in the state as a state of nature in which there exists nothing but a need for food and sex, your biological needs. So symbolic is the area where your desires and emotions are alive. And this is where the interpretation is possible. If at all an interpretation is possible, in a human being's life, it is only possible in the symbolic order. So concepts like death and absence may be integrated into the symbolic order because we have at least some understanding of them, but they may not be interpreted fully. So once we learn any language, like the infant moves from a pre-linguistic state into the realm of language, what happens is that we are unable to move back to the real. The real and the symbolic are two of the three orders, and they live in tension with one another. And the third being the mirror stage. So that is another important stage, which is actually not focused upon by Freud. So the mirror stage actually occurs when the infant looks into a mirror at their own image. They become fascinated by the image they see in the mirror. They may even try to interact with it. But eventually they realize that the image that they are seeing is of themselves. Once they realize this key fact, they incorporate what they see into their sense of I, the me, the self. And this stage, the image they see may not correspond with their inner understanding of the physical self, in which this image that they see before them becomes an ideal that they strive to develop. So these are the basic ideas that psychoanalysts have put forward. Now, as the type of readings that happen and the type of understanding of a human being's psychology. And now this, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, ma'am. We can see that you have prepared nice PPT, but I think we got stuck on Sigmund Freud's slides only.
No, I've just moved it now.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, I will send you the slides, but not all the slides are needed because it just creates a confusion.
Yes.
Right? Now, I hope the slide has changed now. So, yeah, Freud has referred, this is where I'm going to try to look at the psychoanalysis, which has been framing the idea of the human mind as a universalizing discourse, particularly Eurocentric, particularly masculine oriented. And these are the points that I want the participants to think about when I speak about psychoanalysis as a universalizing and masculine discourse. So Freud actually speaks about women's sexuality as a dark continent for psychoanalysis. Within the continent of psychoanalysis, which actually was revealed by Freud, lay this other continent, that is the sexuality or the sexual desire of women that remained concealed, which was not to be seen. The map of it was yet to be drawn, or at least a sketchy map needed to be filled in. It was not absent, but it was present only in concealment and mysteriousness. So we realize that, the othering of the woman's mind actually begins here. And it is very surprising because when we talk about the idea of modernity, the idea of enlightenment, and we talk about the human, when we look at multiple discourses, whether it is enfranchisement, whether it is freedom, whether it is the idea of the body, or whether it is the idea of the mind, we realize that the concept of enlightenment, which focuses on the human, is an exclusive concept, whereby it discards people of other genders like women or people who have fluid genders, people who inhabit liminal spaces as far as gender is concerned, people who are not heterosexual, people who are not white. All these people are not conceptualized within the progressive march of enlightenment. And that becomes very, very clear when Freud actually talks about women's sexuality as a dark continent, which again, I would like you to connect this idea of a dark continent with the imperialist enterprise also, because that is where the link becomes very, very explicit, where for the European, for the white man, when he looks out and he sees the eastern side, he sees it as a blank, a place that needs to be filled in, a place that needs to be given a language, a place that needs to be given an ideology, because we, the people from the East, people from India, or people from Africa, again, Africa made up of multiple nations. We kind of give it a blanket term called Africa, but Africa we may remember as a continent. The multiple experiences of Africa and of Asia, they see it as something which is, not fully developed, which is dark, which they need to fill in. And in the order of things in archaeology of the human sciences, it is there that, the idea of order and categorization, and how categorization becomes very, very political, explicitly political, comes into focus. So Foucault talks about counter sciences or technologies that make possible knowledge about man in general. And he says that the particular relation that the Western ratio establishes with all other cultures is characterized by the relationship between the ethnologist and the informant. So I want you to look at the ethnologist as the person who collects information, and the person who gives him the information becomes a data, an object who's viewed, an object who's treated like a spectacle, an object that is categorized becomes part of the database in order to be categorized as something which can be controlled. And the ideological parameters of the relationship of the ethnologist who's collecting data and the informant who's giving him the data, they are actually determined by the parameters of the colonial origins of anthropology. So the idea of the colonizer and the colonized is very clearly there in the relationship between the person who's collecting data about the people living in these places and the informer, the person who's giving them the information. So reading psychoanalysis from a post-colonial, gender-based perspective shows that it is a masculinist colonial discipline, and it promoted the idea of Western subjectivity, and in opposition to a colonized, feminine, primitive others. So we look at what is known as a master narrative. A master narrative, also like a grand narrative, the idea that a particular formula will fit all problems or will find solutions to all problems. In much the same way, one of the master narratives of European modernity was psychoanalysis. Like many other things, of course, like even modernism, like even the project of enlightenment, it was a master narrative, but with a particular agenda in mind, right? Which was very, very exclusive in nature. So the master narrative of European modernity, and one of them is psychoanalysis, caused what Aimé Césaire reinscribes as something he terms as colonial trauma. And this is a pain that has emerged in writing as well. And, there are different ways of looking at colonial trauma. And another person who's involved in visual media, like cinema, is Kaja Silverman. And Silverman, she has actually understood colonial trauma in terms of historical trauma. And taking her cue from Freud's writings, Silverman conceived of historical trauma as the interruption or deconstitution of master narratives or dominant fictions. So I hope you have understood where you are sort of writing back to the center, like Derrida sort of breaks up these binaries, or post-colonial starting to do, where you start sort of trying to break out of these binaries of the primitive and the cultured and the civilized and the savage, and the psychological aspects that have been included into giving these a sort of validation. But this validation actually goes a long way because they're trying to validate themselves. That is why we were called, white man's burden, because we were not fit enough to govern ourselves based on some sort of psychoanalysis or pseudo-psychoanalysis that they believed in. I hope you remember this fake or pseudoscience called phrenology, and that was very common at one point of time, which said that the size of the skull of your head determines the brain power that you have. This was a fake science, and this was used to actually traumatize colored people. So trauma, or the study of trauma, begins to undo these fictions. The fictions is the meta-narrative, and it turns the cause of trauma into a spectral presence. So Spectre, again, you have constant references to Spectre in Freud, the uncanny in Nicholas Royal, and of course in Derrida also, because even in Marx, you have this idea of the spectre, which is something which is out of joint, which is interrupting the fiction of mastery. So you have this idea of the mastery, and within it there is a scandal. There is a haunting presence of the other, and it questions the transparency of the prose that informs this particular fiction of mastery. The idea that we, the European whites, are born to control and rule the world in order to make it a better place. So Freud's notion of selfhood began as he neared the Second World War to change and fragment in a manner, and he recognized how trauma could be accommodated. And its effective form was actually termed melancholia. So I'll come to this later. Like I began my talk, the roots of psychoanalysis is to be found in the clinic, but it also reveals what has happened to psychoanalysis in terms of influence. It has created a way of thinking and a mode of reflexive self-consciousness that has become taken for granted element for much of cultural experience. So this is based on an argument of an idea that, human beings are self-reflexive subjects in culture. They're social subjects, and they make sense of things around them through an application of the discourses that surround them. So this is exactly what Foucault was also trying to do when he speaks about the archaeology of knowledge. He says that, the idea that humans are self-reflexive and they're social subjects, and they're trying to make sense of their surroundings, the world in which they live in, through the applications of the discourses around them. So the discourses around them are, there are two ways of looking at these discourses. One is, of course, from a very, very post-structuralist perspective, which tells you that, these are all constructed in language, and therefore language is fleeting, and it's very, very ambiguous. Another sense is that this has been created with a particular political agenda in mind. And when you or I, sitting in the East, sitting in the framework of a culture that has been colonized, looks at these discourses, we automatically, or unfortunately, we position ourselves as the other, and we try to understand this also as the other. And we are reading against ourselves in that sense. If you were to look at the reader response theory, we are sort of reading against ourselves as well. So culture, we can see, constantly throws up modes of self-understanding, which are then drawn by subjects in a self-referential way. And this strengthens some of these cultural discourses and sometimes weakens others. But this can be very easily understood if you were to look at the syllabi that is transacted in many departments of English literature across the Indian subcontinent. If you sort of take a look at the syllabi and you look at the number of hours we spend on teaching European writing, American writing, we realize that there is a constant privileging of sorts which is happening there. And those works go by the term literature, whereas when we talk about Indian writing, of course, we have to use an adjective, which means to say that, you have literature and then you have Indian literature, which somehow makes it the other, even in our own context, because this is how we have been looking at literature. This is how it has been framed for us. So I am trying to look at a writer called Freuds, who has actually come up with brilliant ideas regarding Freud's concepts and how Freud's concepts actually validated the imperial enterprise. So Frosch says that, psychoanalysis actually grew up in the crucible of Europe. This is a quotation. It had very specific origins in the scientific culture of the late 19th century. So when we talk about the scientific culture of the late 19th century, and we always approach science with the idea that science is very objective and science is very steady and fixed. But if we were to go through a history of science, particularly medicine, we will understand that, at different times, different types of people were considered to be insane. Different types of behavior were labeled to be insane. So this we have to realize is contextual. This differs from culture to culture. This differs from time to time and place to place. So psychoanalysis grew up at a particular time of 19th century, and again with the current fascination with various branches of occult, the spiritual, the supernatural, and it was laced in its original location with the complexities of Jewish emancipation, the World War, the surrounding the World War, and the stories of trauma that came floating out of the Holocaust memories, and also with the notion of anti-Semitism. Because, this unreasonable or irrational hatred of the Jew is very clearly visible in English literature, beginning from Chaucer, where a fake tale led to the massacre of Jews, and this is actually being used by Chaucer in one of the tales told by his pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. Very clearly visible in Shakespeare as well. So these ideas, these again very, very Eurocentric. It's not that India didn't have our trauma, but the European trauma was actually what we were made to understand as trauma. And it was exported to Britain, actually, this idea of psychoanalysis. And it was connected to psychical research, and very clearly from the beginning, according to Frosch, the idea of psychoanalysis was connected with feminism and art mainly painting. And in America also, it found great acceptance. And after in the course of the Second World War, when there was a huge migration of European scientists and thinkers to America, this spread, the idea of psychoanalysis, it is said, from a very Eurocentric perspective, spread to other countries as well. And one increasingly important issue that we have to focus on is the connection between psychoanalysis and colonialism, and the dissemination of psychoanalysis and the strengthening of the idea of colonialism. So it has a complex history of reproduction of certain colonial tropes. And what are these colonial tropes? The idea of the primitive, the idea of the crude and sexual and destructive impulses, similar to the idea of the savage of the 19th century European imagination. So the idea of the savage has been very clearly transposed onto the non-white population and even to the gender fluid people. So yeah, this is quite a complex idea that has been found in Freud, and this is the quotation that Freud has used: ontology recapitulates phylogeny. So phylogeny is actually the evolution of a species, and ontogeny is the idea of a single individual. So it's a historical hypothesis that the development of an embryo of an animal from fertilization goes through several stages, resembling adult stages in the evolution of the remote ancestors as well. So when you speak of ontology which recapitulates phylogeny, it actually places psychoanalysis, or using this idea which has later discarded, as a discourse of colonialism, meaning that it may not be applicable to non-European cultures, and more strongly stating that it may be a subjugating discourse rather than as an emancipatory or a therapeutic one. I hope my point is clear. If for the European, if for the white man, going to a psychoanalyst meant that he was trying to cure himself of certain maladies, the use of psychoanalysis in the colonies did not lead to any catharsis, any cure, or any therapy. Rather, it became a validating discourse for subjugation. So what do I say? It meant that, you had the clinical clinical validation or clinical authority. That's what I'm looking for. The clinical authority to firmly believe that now these people who are not white, these people who are from the colonies, these people who have a completely different culture from the European culture have to be colonized, have to be subjugated. And that is why it is said that, psychoanalysis is a transformative discipline. So once one is in it, you can see the world from its perspective. And you look at yourself also from a psychoanalytic point of view. So it's a double barrel sort of thing, whereas it is self-transformative. And when you understand psychoanalysis, it is said that when you look at another person, you find some other meaning also there. And it is also bringing about a change. So in pursuing rationalism, but you're enacting sort of irrationalism when it comes to the other, psychoanalysis is caught up in some iconic juxtapositions, some inherent contradictions. So Jacques Derrida, this is not very crucial, but because Derrida often has something to say, very valid to say, I thought I would actually talk a couple of minutes about Derrida's ideas about this. And it is here that, you actually very explicitly get a questioning of the idea of psychoanalysis. In this essay called Geopsychoanalysis, I think it's around 36 pages, Derrida comments on the blindness of psychoanalysis to most of the earth. That is, psychoanalysis, when it looks at the world in general, it has a very different perspective. And that is what he calls a textualization. And what it inscribes on the earth through its worldification, the idea of the world, which is very Eurocentric, being imposed on several other worlds, and the idea of universalization. And it is a violent event of imposing a way of being in the world. That is, you sort of homogenizing lives, when you sort of homogenize cultures, and by actually telling people that, certain people are more likely to be like infants, or more likely to lose their control, then they have to be brought, the sort of discipline has to come in, and they have to behave like certain other people, whereas you don't realize the geolocal context, the culture-specific behavior patterns. So Derrida's project was to criticize polemically the International Psychoanalytic Association and the treatment of what is dismissed by it as the rest of the world. So you have a very clear Western-centric idea of the world, and the rest of the world, which is a very unruly place, which has to be dominated and subjugated. And he says, that's a phrase which I've quoted from Derrida, the Homo psychoanalyticus is unknown or outlawed. And that is why, once more, you sort of reiterate that psychoanalysis is nothing but a colonial discipline, a colonial intellectual formation. And it establishes itself as a form of analysis, and in the age of colonialism. And it creates an idea about the world. And what is this idea about the world that it creates? That is, it is very dependent on the colonial discourse, the political, the ontological relations, and the disciplinary practices. And the disciplinary practices are practiced upon these uncivilized, primitive, timeless, colonized people, because they do not have the ability or to acquire agency, or they do not have the capacity to become agents of themselves, because psychologically they are weak. So as a discipline, it formalizes strategies to normalize a form of civilized being constituted through colonial political dynamics. So you have a national colonial self, which is very European, and it is brought into existence, perhaps more accurately, into unconcealment, and it situated itself in opposition to its repressed, concealed, and mysterious dark continents. So like I said, when Freud speaks about the female sexuality as a dark continent, you have colonial Africa, you have Asia, the multiple countries, nations in Asia, and you have the women who are considered to be primitive. So a post-colonial reader who comes to Freud looking for insights is faced with the difficulty of dealing with this problematic discussion of non-Western civilizations. And the idea that, the metaphors that Freud has used that places neurotic individuals, children, women, and primitive people in close relation to each other. So again, the contrast that is made between the healthy and the neurotic, the European and the non-European, is a very clear instance of how psychoanalysis as an institution constituted itself as a form of modern knowledge, which contributed significantly to the othering of non-Western cultures by defining them as lacking in comparison with the domestic norms. So analogies like Freud, so when you look at these um, comparisons, these metaphors, we realize that these are not apolitical. These are not very poetic or innocent. Rather, it has been very clearly demonstrated that there is a racial content here. So Nancy Lee Stepan, in her study of racial content of the 20th century scientific discourses, argues that when a scientist uses a metaphor, it is not just a whim and fancy. It is not just a quirk. Rather, it is the core component of the scientific knowledge or the theory the scientist is attempting to describe. So I hope that is clear. You have this Nancy Stepan who looks at scientific discourses. I'm talking about very objective discourses where we find the racial content. And she says that the use of certain metaphors by these men of medicine, by these men of science, it is not just a style. It is not just a fashion statement. Rather, it is the core component of the scientific knowledge, which reflects the core component of the point that these scientists are trying to make. So by placing two separate components, previously separate components like the Europe and the East, next to each other, the scientific analogy says something new about each of these separate components. So the analogy between neurotics and savages makes two new observations. Neurotics are a distinctive race within the civilization, and the mental health of the savage is already abnormal. So you're not even having an expectation of this so-called normal behavior from a non-Western person, particularly a colonized other. So psychoanalysis is based then on the close observation of social relationships, which is drawn from anthropological studies of others or case histories of Europeans, and seems to refuse to account for the material, political, and cultural factors that produce these connections. So that is where it becomes very, very important, because it refuses to look at the cultural factors. So we find that in the 1920s and 30s, there was more interest in the colonies, and health professionals started looking very closely at the people who had mental problems and the treatment that had been given to them. So prior to this, mental health in the colonies had not been a high priority. Yeah, and another writer, Jock Moloch, notes that the asylums, the mental asylums, in many colonial countries were considered as a subdivision of the jails. So when the jails were too full, you could send these people. When there was no jail, or you just had a mental asylum, they could substitute for each other. Now, let us look at the colonial psychiatry in Africa. So colonial psychiatry in Africa concluded that Africans did not have the complex inner life that the European had. And they were infantile, they were uncontrolled and uncontrollable, and therefore they cannot function as rational, productive citizens. So please remember that this is not literature at all. These were people of science with a sort of backing or authorization who said that the homogenizing, the entire continent is being homogenized as infantile, as people who had no self-control over themselves, and therefore they needed the supervision of these highly, evolved people, the white people, to supervise them. So Owen Berkeley Hill, now you move from Africa to India, and you have Owen Berkeley Hill, a British psychiatrist in India, who said that, now I quote from Owen Berkeley Hill, he says, the Hindu has all the disadvantageous traits of the anal erotic personality And there is a categorization, like Cooper would have told us, the categorization. So all Hindus, they're irritable, they have bad temper, they are hypochondriac, and they are boring, and they are bent for a tyrannizing, dictating, and obstinacy. So like the Africans, the Hindu Indians were also considered to be infantile. So if the African was an excitable child, the Hindu Indian was a sullen, obstinate child. Both were difficult to govern. Neither was suited to govern themselves. So that is very interesting, because this native population may not have been subjects of psychiatric studies because they were not considered civilized enough to require mental care. I hope you remember, because the mental asylums were also penal colonies where people who committed crimes were put in. So they were not considered evolved enough to, because it is said that, people in the colonies do not suffer from depression or melancholia, because that is something higher minds suffer from. So the colonial asylum was a place for the members of colonizer community, one who became, I'll go to that later, and only for extreme native cases where they kept them. So the colonial specialist's chief concern was the mental health of the colonizers. So I hope, you may have heard of this. There were, I think William Dalrymple has actually written a book about the white Mughal. So going native was something they found. Going native actually meant that the white man was taking, or a white woman was getting more interested in the colonized culture, that they were trying to resort to the ways of Nigeria or India or something like that. But that, they thought, was a sort of nervousness, a nervous breakdown. And in the earlier stage of colonization, going native was a sort of problem that was treated as a mental ailment. So it was called tropical neurasthenia in the Philippines, and the inferior, as Warwick Anderson has spoken about. So the decline and the debilitation of the European psyche in the colonies is an issue, but it never becomes so much of an issue that the Europeans could relinquish or give up the colonial control rather than continue the, the colonial project. So depression, again, like I said, was associated in European thought with guilt, religious doubt, and artistic originality. And this was the very foundation of Western subjectivity. So Africans or Indians did not exhibit these characteristics of Western individualism or the heightened sensibility of a civilized person. Therefore, they could not suffer from depression. And in Octave Menoni, in Prospero and Caliban, he talks about the colonial society in Madagascar. And he very, very says that, the Malagasy personality is a dependent one. And there is no Oedipal complex because the father never wants to take up the role of somebody who is paternal in nature. Rather, unlike the European father, the Malagasy father does not figure as an absolute authority for his children. Rather, he acts as a mediator between the dead ancestors and his own family. Therefore, the Oedipus complex, according to Menoni, is not to be found in this particular colony. So he projects his dependence on everyone else. And the thing that the Malagasy fears most is abandonment. So I hope you understand how the colonial rule is being regulated and ratified, because if they leave, these people will feel abandoned, according to the psychologist. And he draws on European literature to support this argument. And he uses these two characters, Prospero and Robinson Crusoe. And if you look at Robinson Crusoe as well as Shakespeare's Prospero, we'll realize that they do not take any help from the people who were already there or the indigenous natives on a particular island. Rather, they try to impose their way of life on the native. So these men have a particular block to accepting that the others we create in our unconscious do not correspond to the people we actually encounter in the world. Instead of accepting this reality, colonial types display an irrational need to control everybody around them. And it is in this context that Fann comes in. And I think, Fann actually does a huge service to the idea of psychoanalysis, because it disrupts the basic idea, the Eurocentric idea, the trap into which this psychoanalysis had fallen into. in the context of the European attempts to psychoanalyze the colony, the colonizers, and this is the context in which Fann enters the discussion on mental health and colonialism in 1952. So Fann was not a psychiatric doctor, but still he gave a lot of importance in his study to psychology. And he tries to illuminate the social and psychological reality of the man of color's experience of colonialism. So Fanon was not a psychoanalyst, but still he sort of uses this basic idea in order to understand the traps that were created by this so self-validating medical discourse. So he says that the black man's alienation is not an individual question. And he comes with a neologism, which is sociogeny. This is Fanon's creation. And it can be understood. He doesn't use sociology. He uses sociogeny. That is, he asks us to consider the history of the development of a particular racist colonial society. So I hope you understand how Fanon works word by word to disrupt the universalizing, the idea of the essentializing psychoanalysis, which very clearly, very clearly biased against the blacks, had positioned them as the other. So I quote from Fann, understanding the alienation of the black man or putting together the psychology of the black man will mean looking at the way in which a racist colonial society exists and produces its effects. He does not criticize the absence of a socio-political or socio-economic perspective. He insists that for the black man, an immediate recognition of social and economic realities must come into play. So, unless and until you understand the context of the black man, you cannot impose these Eurocentric ideas of sanity and insanity onto him. So Fann says, the conflict in South Africa is between the working class whites and the blacks, and it is fundamentally a result of the economic structure of South Africa. So far from being a psychological misunderstanding or a human flaw, the apartheid policy aimed at separation of the natives from the Europeans, territorially, economically, and on the political level. So Fann says with bitter clarity, Fann says, Europeans go to these colonies because it is possible for them to grow rich there. And it is not for any other discourse, sort of validation or any other sort of civilizing and project that the white man goes to these colonies. So he describes the mental and physical torment of living with colonial conflict and being forced to play a part in that conflict. So the fate of the colonized people and the constant trauma that they undergo have to be understood within the specifics of the geolocal context of the particular nation that they inhabit. This includes physical symptoms and personal dilemmas that result from surviving mass murder, living in the knowledge that soldiers have raped and degraded your partner or yourself, committing terrorist activity and torturing other human beings. So psychology of colonial conflict then is not a realm of abstract complexes and personalities, but a destructive encounter between a set of people who aim to dominate and another set of people who will not accept that domination anymore. So Homi Bhabha has also used this idea of psychoanalysis, and he has actually focused upon the use of the word fetish. And again, when we look at I don't think I will have a lot of time to go into the idea of fetish, but just to say, the concept of fetish has been taken from different contexts. And we'll just very quickly take a look at the idea of fetish and the history and the complicated history this idea of fetish has. So fetish is always talking about some sort of, unacceptable obsession with something. And again, it very clearly in the realm of psychoanalysis, very clearly in the realm of the study of the mind. So Bhabha uses the term fetish in a purely psychoanalytic term, and it is a narrowing of a concept. And McIntosh and Young have pointed out that fetish is a term with a very long and varied history, because I'm sure that you would have heard about totems and taboos and how fetish has played a part in the worship systems of several groups of people. So The early French philosopher Brose has used the term fetishism to describe certain early religions. So he, I quote, says primitive religions to those who worshipped inanimate objects, believing them to be imbued with spirits or magical properties. Later, you have Karl Marx, who takes up the term commodity fetish to refer to the magical qualities that appear to inhere in the commodities in industrial economies. And Freud, again, was one of the latest of significant theorists to take up the term. And Freud used fetish to define a sexual condition in which a very unlikely object is invested with erotic qualities and must be present for sexual relationship to take place. So McClintock, she reminds us that all of these conceptualizations are based or predicated on the idea of the primitive idea of worshipping. And whenever I use primitive, I'm using it with inverted quotations because that is a very typical Eurocentric way of looking at things. Primitive way of worshipping and celebrating an inappropriate object, thereby displacing what the modern imagination could not incorporate onto the invented domain of the primitive. So whatever they found uncomfortable would be pushed off into the other. If you look at the way vocabulary evolves, it is very, very easy to understand this because you talk about brutes and you talk about brutal murder and brutal rape. A brute is actually referring to animal, but animals do not murder. Animals just kill to eat, and animals don't rape either. So these are things which human beings have done, but because they cannot actually face that, they are worse than animals, we create a vocabulary whereby we thrust these characteristics onto something else. Much the same way, when you have a hierarchy, the gender hierarchy or the race hierarchy, the people in power will automatically create this sort of set of ideas and push it onto something that they have found unacceptable. So fetish is a very troubling concept, and Baba uses it to explain stereotypes, but it does not comment on the terms that Freud had used to set up this theory. So Freud had written that fetish itself was very inappropriate, an object very inappropriate with sexual purpose. And it is with some justice likened to the fetishes in which savages believed their gods were embodied. So there are comparisons with the savage or the primitive to illustrate the aberrant and damning shortcoming in the age of evolutionary theory and archaic behavior. So Baba actually does not comment on its non-psychoanalytic forms, but he just puts fetishism back into the colony. So McClintock suggests that fetishes can be seen as the displacement onto a person of contradictions that the individual cannot resolve at a personal level. So this is what I have already spoken about, that you sort of push it on into something more acceptable. And I think the latter part of her quotation is what I would like to focus on now, because she says fetish, when we talk about the idea of the commodity fetish, I think McClintock is actually using that. And she says that you can have an explanation of various objects and symbols that emerged during the age of imperialism, including the fetishisms for national culture and the symbols that were representing particular nations, like the flags, the maps, the costumes, and national spectacle as well. And that is where another terminology has been used, which is known as psychic economy. So it is one of the first proper names for substantifying the workings of desire, the sexuality, the psyche, and even the conscious mind, designating the foundational structure of psychosocial life and theoretical insights into a specific mode of economy, which is capitalism. So, yeah. I'll just skip over this and move on to two very important writers who have actually tried to reinvent the idea of the Oedipus complex. And they talk about something called the Antiodipus, Deleuze and Guattari. So again, this is closely connected with dismantling the homogenizing, universalizing, Eurocentric idea of psychoanalysis. So according to Deleuze and Guattari, Anti-Oedipus is to oppose the social, political, historical formations, which can be capitalism or psychoanalysis, which fix desire into homogeneous forms, into singularities, They theorize that the desiring machines produce their productions immediately and unfold into the social field. So the schizoanalytic argument, that's the argument that they put forward in Anti-Oedipus. So they talk about desire as a machine. And the order of desire is the order of production. So production is at once desiring, production as well as social production. Therefore, we reproach psychoanalysis for having stifled this order of production, for having shunted it into representation. So there are multiple ways of looking at it. One of it is that, we're talking about the order of production, which is mechanical. And to be mechanical, it has to be homogeneous. So you are sort of becoming very tyrannical when it comes to desire, whereby you're labeling acceptable desire and unacceptable desire. You're talking about perversions, right? And all these things have a very close connect with the sociological, the political structure of a particular society that you live in, the age in which you live in, which later questions the very same things. For example, until recently, homosexuality was considered to be a crime in many parts of the world. Very recently have we decriminalized it. And in Europe and in America, you have these testimonial narratives coming out from people who were found to be gay in the early part of the century, in 1930s and 40s and all that. And they have come up with testimonial narratives to say that they were treated as mentally ill persons because this was considered to be a perversion. And they were thought that, mental treatment could cure them of desire. And this is what the schizoanalytic argument is all about, because desire is considered to be a machine of production. Sorry. And Anti-Oedipus outlines a practice, what they term a schizoanalysis, that reveals how desire gets trapped in structures like Oedipus and how we might release ourselves from our attachment to Oedipus. It is in this sense that Foucault's preface to this describes the text as a book of ethics, a guide to living, that we do not yearn for the enslavement of our own desires, or less dramatically, the representation and interpretation of our desires by others on our behalf. So Anti-Oedipus foregrounds desire as an important factor in any social, historical, or political analysis. And this is why you can use Deleuze and Guattari in post-colonial studies. When we come to the next part is, of course, talking about gender. And in particular, I've spoken about the idea of, the heteronormativity, which was there in the production of desire, and how multiple sexualities, you have the LGBTQ plus shades of genders coming in, and how they were all tried or attempted by the medical discourse to be normalized. So when you there is a testimonial narrative by Villoy called, she's an intersex person, and she talks about the intervention of medical discourse into forcing people into accepting one gender when they are born as both. So the idea is to live in the way that they wish to, not according to the way in which the medical discourse has prescribed. So when we look at psychoanalysis and feminism, it's very, very clear that, for a long time, gender and women were considered to be not, like Freud talks about the idea of desire of a woman as a very, very dark continent. And psychoanalysis takes shape as a therapeutic method, and feminism is a very political strategy. And these two systems actually questioned as theories of human liberation. And at times they were in conflict or in competition, but feminism has actually been able to reinvent psychoanalysis and the way in which women have been considered by psychoanalysis. And in the second sex, actually, Simone de Beauvoir, who's quite interested in the idea of the female mind, talks about an anecdote narrated by Denise Rogemont. It is that a lady imagined that when she took a walk in the country, the birds were attacking her. Then she was taken to a psychiatrist, and the treatment, the many types of treatment were carried out of her obsession. But the doctor, finally, who went to the garden with her, noticed that the birds were indeed attacking her. So this is a joke, but it actually questions whether the women have a right to actually talk about themselves, or whether, like later Gilbert and Guba talks about the mad woman who has been shut up in the attic. Because, the idea of the word hysteria. Hysteria is aberrant behavior, they say. And this aberrant behavior comes from the uterus. And those who possess the uterus, in other words, a woman who's capable of giving birth, she actually exhibits these sorts of hysterical behavior. And that is very clearly a very masculine oriented narrative regarding psychoanalysis. So French feminism, which was greatly impacted by Lacan, and his ideas have been taken up, transformed, and challenged. You have Irigaray on one hand and Julia Kristeva on the other. And Lacan's work is both praised for its debiologization of Freud, and it's also critiqued for its phallocentrism. And these two aspects are in fact imbricated as both hinge on Lacan's elaboration of knowledge as a symbolic order that precedes and makes possible human subjectivity. So for Irigaray, there are three stages, she says. One is deconstructing the masculine subject. The next is figuring the possibility for a feminine subject and construing an intersubjectivity that respects sexual difference. So according to Irigaray, sexual difference is not a system of domination to be overcome, but a cultural process and a practice that has to be nourished. And the actual relationship of domination and subordination and this binary of sexual difference and the fraternal order, all this is immanent sexual differentiation. So that is how Irigaray has sort of positioned that. And she argues that a pre-Oedipal mother-daughter relationship has not been taken up in the signifying order. Like the mirror stage, and identifying with the father. So the pre-Oedipal mother-daughter stage has not been taken up with enough attention, and the order retroactively denies that such a relationship ever existed. Since a daughter becomes a daughter properly, becomes feminized or sexually differentiated only post-Oedipally. So this is Irigaray's argument. So, and of course, Kristeva also sort of goes into it. And but I don't think I will have the time to dwell on Kristeva, because Kristeva is rather complex, and she uses post-structuralism and the ideas afforded by deconstruction to look at the idea of women. And I think it is where Kristeva talks about the abject and the melancholic breakdown that she actually quite brilliantly theorizes the loss of women's creativity and women's access to language and the creative self-confirmation, because all this was actually based on the gender politics that was in place at a particular point of time. So, I thought I'd stop a little before 5, because if there are questions, I can take it up. So, I'll just wind up with this Sedgwick lecture, which was given by Anne McClintock, because Anne McClintock is a writer who I'm quite taken up by the way in which she has theorized the colonial formations and the gender formations of post-psychoanalytic theory. So she gives you an example, an anecdote. On 6 July 1937, a baby was born inside a mental hospital. And the reason why the baby was born inside this mental hospital was because the mother was white and the father was black. The mother was judged insane because she became pregnant with a black man. She was diagnosed as premature senile dementia and was locked in the mental institution for life. The baby was born a few months later and instantly removed from the mother and placed in foster care. 6 years later, the mother commits suicide. So this is how Anne McClintock begins the Sedgwick lecture. And, we were talking about the idea of the European going native, but look at the way how a woman who falls in love with a black man, if she's white, the way in which she's treated. And we recall all those texts which focused on the love of a black man and the European woman. From Othello onwards, we have been seeing this, the unreasonable jealousy and all these things, where we read Othello from a very clearly racial point of view. And she also asks us to look at Jane Nair. I'm sure all of you have gone through Jane Nair, and the question that she's asking is, how is Bertha Rochester, Roberta Merson's madness actually figured? How is madness actually disclosed? So this is the point that I want to end with. What is essentially an invisible inner condition is rendered as a visible outer condition. It is displayed in the case of Jane Rochester's wife as a derangement of the surface of the body. Madness becomes an anatomical allegory, a spectacle to be visually consumed, and madness enters a scopic politics, which is an optics of truth as well. So Bronte's novel, Madness, becomes a visual allegory, not of the inner mind, but of the outer body as surface and spectacle. So this scene, above all, presents mental deviance primarily and most strikingly as a condition of racial deviance as well. And that is why I chose McIntosh's lecture actually, because it sort of brings together the two discourses that I was trying to bring into focus using the perspective afforded by psychoanalysis. So mental deviance is consumed by Jane Eyre's readers as a spectacle of racial deviance. And the idea of mental deviance is actually superimposed on racial deviance. So a well-established European tradition held that madness was a condition of exile. The mentally ill were not physically confined, but were banished beyond the walls of a town. And you have this recurring image of the ship of fools. All right, if madness was a condition of exile and madness is a foreign country, what about madness inside a foreign country? And the minute one asks this question, a number of interesting things, according to McClintock, begins to emerge. If the mentally ill in the imperial metropolis are racialized, in the colonies, they were domesticated and territorialized. They were subjected to the cult of domesticity, which is again, bringing in patriarchy and the idea of that women are willing to be subjugated. Women want to be dominated, just the way in which the native from the continent of Africa wants to be dominated. And the contradictions and dilemmas these distinctions threw up, haphazard, invented as they were, managed and contained. So Lynette Jackson's important work on Ingutshini, which is a place of refuge, a mental institution in colonial Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, she shows that the legal and medical discourses on African madness repeatedly figure the mad African woman as a stray woman. So out of the 45 cases, 23 people she studied were incarcerated because they were stray. Stray means they were wandering around. So African women were put into this institution because they were diagnosed as found at the crossroads of wandering, often in a state of undress. And the state of undress is by European standards. This doesn't change at all. So what is cultured, what is civilized is, by European standards. And this woman, again, was walking with a child, but with no man. So you have a mental institution which takes shape around these discourses of pathology and the discourses of cure also. And according to Lynette, the therapy for Black and white women varied, even in the same institutions. So let us see what the cure and what the final outcome was. For African women to be doing well meant to accept colonial forms of menial work and female docility. To be cured was to become pliable, docile, domesticated. White women, by contrast, were not expected to do manual work. They were figures of conspicuous leisure. In the center of the white woman's ward at this place was a beauty parlor. A woman who was doing well was diagnosed as that she's perfectly all right if she went to the beauty parlor and had her hair done. So the colonial asylum was a repository and a threshold institution, again, to go back to Foucault, and in the flesh for those bodies which the colonial regime could not contain. Culturally, it was a factory for reproducing the ideas of normal space, normal work, normal sexuality. And we realize that the idea of the normal can be quite disturbing, can be quite confining. And the idea of the normal is finally what leads to fascism, because a single order is seen to prevail for all sorts of behaviors. And if you're not subscribing to this particular ordained behavior, you are deemed as unnatural, you're deemed as deviant, and you require treatment. So again, that is where Deleuze and Guattari's idea of the rhizome, Zizek's idea of quilting, all this becomes beautiful because it talks of plurality. It talks about multiple entry points, multiple exit points, and talks about celebrating what is known as heterogeneity. Thank you. Any questions? Hello? Are there any questions?
Yes, participants, you can ask questions.
Ma'am, can you please tell the name of the person who wrote that black? Can you hear me?
Yes, Anne McClintock.
Okay, so the black man, the white woman and the black man that you told,
Yeah.
no?
That is the final thing. I will share this PPT with you, and it is actually part of a Sedgwick lecture. There is a copy available of the Sedgwick lecture, and that is what I was talking about.
Okay, ma'am, thank you. Actually, that is really interesting to know. This is the first time I know about it. That's why. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rajesh, Dr. Rajesh, do you wish to ask question? Those who wish to ask questions only, they will unmute.
Good evening, madam. It was an excellent talk, but there is one question I would like to ask, and
Sure.
that is in many of the literary texts, majority of the times it is the women who are shown as mentally ill and not the main characters. So is there any gender bias in that?
Of course, there is, I would say, because when your once person is diagnosed mentally ill, the agency is completely absent. You cannot be held accountable for what you say or what you think. Therefore, as it is, women have less agency when compared to men in a patriarchal culture. So it becomes very safe for the male writer to position the woman as, not normal, not up to the mark, somebody who needs a stern hand of control. And that sort of satisfies the ego, I guess. And validates it, validates patriarchy as well. What, according to you, is the place of Lacan? Yeah, Lacan has a very important place, I'm sure. But yeah, again, we must remember that there is no universalizing Lacan any more than there is universalizing any of these people. What we have to do is look at them from a very, very socio-political context. And that is why, when we write our PhD thesis, for a long time we were told never to use the I, the first person, because we were told to be very objective. But there is no objectivity in any sort of inquiry. You are very clearly imbricated in the process of inquiry. Your idea of knowledge comes from your socio-political, your gender perspective. And that is why I said, when you look at Lacan, do not take him to be the final word or the final authority. Look at him to question him. Can African American literature be studied from the side? Of course it can. It must be, I would say. Are there any more questions?
Ma'am, do check your chat box if there are any.
No, the mad woman in the attic. No, they're just asking for the, can we also relate? Yeah, you can definitely relate Jane Eyre. Definitely.
Bharati Raje Bhosle, ma'am, are you there?
Yes, sir. I am here.
Wait, just a minute.
Okay, sir.
So now we have come to the end of this second session. Ma'am, shall we stop over here?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, now I request Bharati Raje Bhosle, madam, to propose vote of thanks.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I, Dr. Bharati Raje Bhosle, would like to express vote of thanks on the occasion of Faculty Development Program. It's an honor for me to thank you all dignitaries. On behalf of Department of English, KTHM College, I extend my gratitude to our honorable speaker, Dr. Priya Nair, madam, for gracing this session. Thank you very much, madam, for very informative, interesting, and mind-blowing session on psychoanalysis. I would like to thank Honorable Dr. V.B. Gaikwad, sir, Principal, KTHM College, for his support and encouragement to make this program successful. I extend my gratitude to Dr. Sharad Binno, Head of the Department, Senior colleague Dr. Yogesh Gangurde, Dr. Tushar Patil, Coordinator of this FDP, and Organizing Committee, and all the participants. Thank you very much once again for making this FDP a great success. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.